Grandfather Yakov's name was Yakov Semyonovich Gorlik, and this was the first thing he considered necessary to announce upon meeting someone, not because the name carried any particular significance, but because sharing it with that Blyumkin gave him, in his own words, a special claim to the subject. What claim, and to what exactly, he never elaborated. He was 87 years old. He lived in a one-room flat on Taganka among archival folders that occupied every available surface, including a portion of the bathroom, and he drank tea the way people drink tea when they have long understood that tea is the only ritual civilization has left them intact, without redactions or revisions. I came to see him on a Thursday. He opened the door in his pajamas, with the expression of a man who had been expecting precisely this. "My grandfather," said Yakov Semyonovich, pouring tea with surgical precision, "worked as an investigator. Not out of conviction. He was the sort of man who becomes an investigator for the same reason others become accountants. It presented itself. His name was Semyon Aronovich. A careful man, with a good memory and a complete absence of professional ambition, which in the 30s was both a rarity and, simultaneously, the only reliable protection against being shot." He paused and nudged a bowl of dry rolls toward me. "In 1958, a Colonel Ivanov came to see him." "Which Ivanov?" I asked. "Precisely," said Grandfather Yakov, with the satisfaction of a man who has just been asked the right question. "Which one?" In Soviet intelligence, Ivanov meant roughly what X means in mathematics, an unknown that doesn't need to be identified in order to solve the equation. Colonel Ivanov arrived one evening, sat down, drank his tea, and told Grandfather Semyon the following: "There is a version of events that needs to be checked quietly, no paperwork, no registration, no consequences." The version concerned the Blyumkin affair of 1929. Specifically its final episode. "The execution?" Grandfather Semyon asked. "The alleged execution," said Colonel Ivanov, and looked out the window with the expression of a man for whom the words alleged and confirmed had long ceased to be antonyms. The version was as follows. Serving in the execution detail that night was a certain Babchenko. Not an officer, not an enlisted man, something in between, the kind of person who exists within systems the way grease exists within machinery, invisible, indispensable, noticed only when something begins to squeak. Babchenko possessed, according to available intelligence, abilities of a hypnotic nature. Not in the circus sense, not watch the pendulum. In a quieter, and therefore more serious register, he could instill in the minds of those around him an absolute conviction that they had seen things they had not seen, or that they had not seen things they had. The distinction is minor, the consequences are not. Where did the investigator get this information about Babchenko? I asked. Grandfather Yakov raised a finger. That is precisely what my grandfather asked. Ivanov replied briefly, from sources that are not discussed. Which meant either from archives to which the colonel had access that no one else did, or from nowhere at all, which in intelligence work is often the same thing. The version proposed the following. Babchenko, on that November night, had brought all those present at the execution into a state of managed certainty. They saw what they were meant to see. They heard what they were meant to hear. They signed the paperwork with clean consciences. Blyumkin was not at the place of execution that night. Or he was, and walked away. Which, strictly speaking, amounts to the same thing as far as the archival record is concerned. But what raised the suspicion? I asked. If everything went cleanly? Grandfather Yakov set down his glass. He rose and crossed to one of the folders with the confidence of a man who knows where everything is in a space where such knowledge seems impossible. He produced a sheet of paper. Private Beller, he said. Yefim Naumovich Beller, 22 years old, conscripted from Zhytomyr, serving as a guard. Present at the execution that night. Unlike everyone else, he saw what was actually there, rather than what he was supposed to see. What did he see? That no one knows. Because Beller never spoke of it. Not a word. Ever. He gave a statement that matched the other witnesses' accounts perfectly, word for word. Which is itself suspicious, because normal witness statements don't match word for word. People are different, they notice different things. Verbatim agreement means either collusion or a single source. The source was Babchenko. But Beller, as Colonel Ivanov later established through sources that are not discussed, was immune. To hypnosis? Completely. Absolutely. Clinically. Grandfather Yakov paused. Interestingly, this quality is documented. Beller was tested 3 times, using different methods. The result was the same each time. The man is not susceptible. Not at all. As though he had something inside him that reflected suggestion back at its source. Certain people are built that way. It was usually attributed to some specific internal disposition, a quality that the medicine of the time explained with the word constitution, which explained nothing, but sounded scientific. And Beller was seen. That is the crux of it. He was seen, twice, on separate occasions, by independent witnesses, near a building on the Arbat where Blyumkin rented a room, and near a synagogue. Grandfather Yakov paused for precisely as long as was needed to allow the listener to feel the weight of what came next. Near the synagogue of Rabbi Nachman. Did the synagogue of Rabbi Nachman still exist? I asked. He had disappeared. The synagogue existed, said Grandfather Yakov. Nachman disappeared, the synagogue did not. That is an important distinction. Places outlive people. Sometimes that is precisely why they exist. He refilled the tea. My grandfather investigated this version for 8 months. Quietly, carefully, without paperwork, as he had been instructed. He found 3 witnesses who had seen Beller. He found one indirect document, a delivery receipt from a shop near the Arbat building, dated 1931, bearing a signature resembling Beller's. He found an entry in the synagogue's visitors' register, which for some reason had never been seized, the name Y&B, initials consistent. What did he do with it? He passed it to Colonel Ivanov. Verbally. No copies. Ivanov listened, nodded, and said, "Good." Then he stood up, said his farewells, and left. Grandfather Semyon never saw him again. What became of the investigation, unknown. What became of Colonel Ivanov, also unknown. Notably, no Ivanov of that period appears in any archive. Not a single one. So the colonel didn't exist? The colonel, said Grandfather Yakov, with a faint smile, existed precisely to the extent he needed to. That is a particular kind of existence. Some people practice it deliberately. He rose, went to the window, and stood for some time looking out at Taganka, not the way one looks at a street, but the way one looks through it, towards something situated considerably further away. But I, he said without turning round, have a different version. An entirely different one. About the egg. Different from your grandfather's? My grandfather was investigating Blyumkin. I was investigating the egg. Those are 2 separate inquiries that merely masquerade as one. He returned to the table. He opened a folder I hadn't noticed before. It had somehow appeared on the table, though I hadn't seen him bring it. The monks, said Grandfather Yakov, gave the egg willingly. I said nothing. You see the irony? The entire theft narrative is a legend. A beautiful one, a convincing one, with all the right details. Blyumkin was a theatrical man. He understood that a good story about a theft protects an object better than any hiding place. Stolen things are searched for. Things that have been passed along, those are watched. The difference is fundamental. According to Grandfather Yakov's version, assembled from archival fragments, 3 private letters, and 1 document in Turkish that he had translated himself, having learned the language at 74. For the sake of accuracy, the story looked quite different. The monastery of Tashilhunpo had, since the early 20th century, maintained contact with a particular group of people in Istanbul. Not Turks. Grandfather Yakov never referred to them by any name other than those in Istanbul, not out of conspiracy, but because he did not know their precise name, and approximate names he refused to use on principle. Who were they? I asked. People who occupy themselves with what no one else occupies themselves with, said Grandfather Yakov. There are things that have existed too long to be managed by states. States change. These people do not. Or they change more slowly. At roughly the same pace that eggs change. The monks had transferred the egg deliberately. Through Blyumkin, as a courier who believed himself to be a thief. It is an elegant method of transport. A man convinced of his own cunning guards a cargo better than any professional, because he guards it with his self-regard. But then why close the gates? Why chase him across the mountain pass? Theodore, said Grandfather Yakov simply. A man who has stolen something under threat of his life will protect it differently from a man who has been given it. Blyumkin had to believe the egg was his. Only then could he carry it through. Carry it where? To Istanbul. To those who were waiting. Blyumkin tried to reach them several times. Through old contacts, it didn't work. Through new intermediaries, it didn't work. Those in Istanbul did not respond. They were silent. With the methodical silence of people who have an answer but for whom the moment has not yet come. Why hadn't it come? Grandfather Yakov shrugged. That I don't know. Perhaps Blyumkin was not the intended courier. Perhaps the route had changed. Perhaps the egg was meant to pass through Moscow, precisely at that time. Some routes exist not for efficiency but for something else. For what, the participants don't always understand. He was quiet for a moment. And so he invented the Germans. The episode with the Germans, in Grandfather Yakov's account, was neither a commercial venture nor a betrayal. It was an attempt to create noise. Do you follow the logic? He said. If you cannot reach the right people quietly, reach them loudly. A scandal involving German intelligence, the egg as a bargaining piece, a deposit already received. This was not a sale. It was a signal. A very loud one, a very visible one, calculated on the assumption that those in Istanbul would hear it and respond. Would make contact. Would give a sign. And a signal came from Istanbul, said Grandfather Yakov. Only not to Blyumkin. To everyone else. To the Germans, close your mouths, forget this, step away. To Lyova, disappear, which he did with his characteristic professional speed. To the NKVD, do what you do, and don't ask unnecessary questions about the egg. Which also, by and large, succeeded. Questions were asked, but without consequences. Blyumkin was eliminated on a signal from Istanbul. Grandfather Yakov looked at me with mild disappointment. No one eliminated anyone. That is far too crude for a story of this caliber. Blyumkin created a situation in which the Soviet system did what the Soviet system does by its nature. It removed a source of uncertainty. Istanbul simply cleared the way for that natural process to proceed. The difference between killing and allowing to be killed is roughly the same as the difference between stealing an egg and permitting oneself to be robbed. And Nachman? I asked. Grandfather Yakov smiled. For the first time in the whole conversation, genuinely, without irony. Nachman, he said, is a separate story, one that admits no version. Only facts. First, he disappeared. Second, Beller was seen near his synagogue. Third, he raised a finger. In the archive of the Istanbul district of Balikli, a place where people live for a very long time and offer very little explanation as to why, in the Balikli archive there is a record of a certain arrival in 1932. The record is incomplete. The name N, from Russia. With an object for safekeeping. I looked at him. N, that's Nachman? That is the letter N, said Grandfather Yakov. Nothing more. The archives of Balikli do not favor specifics. They don't favor anything that might later be used as evidence. Evidence is for people who need to convince someone. Those in Istanbul convince no one. They have no need to. I asked him, as I was leaving, what he thought had become of Beller. Where he had gone. Grandfather Yakov rose and went to the window again. Outside, the darkness was falling with the particular Moscow thoroughness with which darkness falls in October, unhurried, but without any possibility of reprieve. Beller, he said. Saw the truth. On that November night, he saw what was actually there, not what Babchenko was showing everyone. And he kept silent about it. His whole life, he kept silent. That requires either great cowardice or great understanding. I incline toward the latter. A person who understands that he sees more than others usually stays quiet, not out of fear, but because he knows, words diminish what they describe. Certain things exist only so long as no one speaks of them. He turned from the window. Like the egg, you understand? While it is whole, everything within it remains possible. Bello was a man who knew how to keep whole things whole. Such people are rare. They tend, as a rule, to live longer than the rest. He said this in a perfectly level voice, without inflection, without the flicker of a wink. I left in darkness. At the door I turned back. Yakov Semyonovich, the egg. Where is it now? He looked at me from the depths of the flat, from behind the stacks of folders, from behind the glasses of cooled tea, from behind 87 years lived alongside this question. Where it belongs, he said. Whole. The door closed. The stairwell smelled of something indefinite, not the old Soviet corridor smell, not the smell of time itself, but something third, for which the Russian language does not yet have a word. I thought, perhaps it doesn't need one. Editor's note: Yakov Semyonovich Gorlik passed away the following February. His relatives spent 3 weeks clearing the flat on Taganka. The archival folders resisted all attempts at cataloging. The contents, according to his niece, refused to arrange themselves in any order, no matter how you tried. Among the papers, one object was found that had nothing to do with the archive, a small wooden box without a lock. Inside empty, but with a distinctive impression on the base, oval, roughly the size of a hen's egg. The box was warm. The niece said it was probably the radiator nearby. There was no radiator nearby.